Hi, this is Patsy with a Z. Welcome to Joy on Paper Live, a program for writers and those who dream of writing. And today I have a very special guest, Ruth Bonapace. And she has a funny book, and I love funny books. And so I want to show you the cover right away. And here it is. Hi, Ruth.
Hi.
Oh, it's nice to see you. And as I said, I wanted everybody to get the flavor of this program because we need to see this, the Bulgarian Training Manual. If you tell people, oh, I want you to read the Bulgarian Training Manual, they might not. They might think you're strange until they see this cover, which will then entice you and get you looking at it. So I was really thrilled when I got it, and I thought, this sounds interesting. I was a kickboxer, and so I believe in training hard. And I thought, and the Bulgarians are good. The Bulgarians, wrestling, weightlifting, and gymnastics. So I thought, okay, maybe I'll learn something in this book. It's, I think it's just so much fun. And just when I got it, as I said, of course, the cover was intriguing, and I actually felt I was my background here. I just have this white background, and I thought that's very ordinary. And I thought maybe Ruth is really wild out there. And look at, I'm wearing a fancy shirt for you. I thought, and there you are, very properly dressed. I love it. But so I thought maybe I needed to have a really bold background for you. Oh, I thought that seems more appropriate for Ruth because it is. You are you've created a very big sensation here with this book, and I wanted to both compliment you on the book. You've gotten wonderful reviews. You've gotten such high praise, and I thought maybe you'd tell us a little bit. First of all, I want to also compliment you on your Amazon page. You have right up front your about author, and you've written your about author, and that is so well written. Now, most authors actually don't put their about author up on the Amazon front of the page. They have just the ordinary one. But I like the one where it's first person and you've written about yourself. And you've written about yourself and made yourself really interesting. If I was just reading the about the author and I read that, I'd say, my goodness, I want to read this author because one, she knows how to write, and two, she's got an interesting background. And I thought, well, why don't we just talk a little bit about your background and see what's happening? Because you do have an interesting background, and here we have some things to talk about.
Okay. Where do we start?
So tell us this about author. Tell us about yourself.
Okay.
Italian, Hoboken, what else?
I'm Italian American. My father was born in Italy, and I was laughing because I see the picture. What a surprise! He was a knife sharpener, and he had a wheel just like that in the basement of our house where he would sharpen knives. He did like deliveries for supermarkets, delis, restaurants, and he would give them sharpened knives, take back the dull ones and bring them home, and then sharpen them, and so on and repeat. But yeah, and I. Oh my gosh, the laundromat. I actually ran a laundromat for about a year, and it was quite an experience. It was very frustrating at the time, and the people wouldn't show up, and I'd have to go in, and I'm like, why am I working as a laundromat attendant? There are many other things I should be doing. But I learned a lot, and I observed people. I listened to the way they spoke, and that really informed a lot of the voice and a lot of the things in this book, even though it's not about a laundromat. I do mention it here and there, but it was, yeah, really just threw me into a whole world of people and really noticing and spending time there as opposed to people who just drop off their laundry and leave. Anyway, that was,
All
and
of
then,
our life experiences, we use them eventually. As writers, they somewhere in all those brain cells, as Hercule Poirot says, we've got a lot of them. And with writers, those brain cells get filled up with all sorts of. You never know what you're going to use. It can be the weirdest thing.
I completely believe that. And in fact, I don't know if I said it in my author's page because I haven't looked at it in a while, but I think everything counts. Every single thing we do can inform what else we do creatively. I was a journalist when I got out of college, and then I eventually got a job at Associated Press. And I covered sports there, professional sports for a few years. And I don't write about sports teams per se, but that interaction with the athletes at an elite level, getting into understanding their superstitions, their habits, and all of that. It's just everything. And then other jobs as well. It's if you've never had a job, that's why they say, not to digress too much, but if you're in a Master's of Fine Arts program, which I went back to school after years, I was like 50 years old when I got my Master's in Fine Arts. But they say, like, your life experiences, if you're 19, 20, 21 years old, you come out of college and you want to write a memoir. I'm not denigrating anybody's memoir. Is very young. You may have a lot to say, but most people don't have a sum total of a lot of different experiences coming to bear like you do as you get older.
And it it's so much fun to have all of this background because, as you said, when you start writing at 50, but you've done all these things, these little things, the strangest things can come back to you just at the right time. And boy, it makes a difference. It makes your books more interesting, gives them depth, and you really look at occupations differently when you have a character who's a working person and you've been a working person and you know what it is. That's one thing. And there's so much to do with that. And of course, you have also had some literary influences, people or writers
Yeah.
who have influenced you. So have you particularly felt a kinship to?
There's a lot of writers like over the ages. Like right now, today, writing today, like Mark Lehner writes off the wall fiction, but it's mostly, I feel it's very male oriented, but he does bend genres. Like I have some screenwriting and poetry and all kinds of things like mashed into here, and he does that too. And then some of the women fiction writers like Helen Simonson and Meg Wolitzer, they write very different types of books than me, very different, but just the way of telling a story and the voice and the different characters. And then beyond that, one of the big influences was Carson McCullers, who's a writer from the South back in the 1950s. And she wrote a short story, a novella. It's really actually a novella called The Ballad of the Sad Cafe. And she also wrote A Member of the Wedding. And the way she creates these characters that are a little bit odd, but very relatable and describing scenes and towns. And that really influenced me in terms of visualizing and describing the places that they've been, because she has a place in the South that she describes as dreary. There's nothing going on. And to read that, it's okay, why am I going to read further? But you realize there's a lot going on. And it's the way of telling about place that brings you in. So I've learned from a lot of writers
Well,
living and
one of the names that you mentioned, which I found very touching, was you mentioned, of course, Walt Whitman and Mark
oh yeah.
Twain, but I like that you mentioned Octavia Butler
Oh
because
yes,
most
yes.
people, she passed away at too young, and her books are really fantastic and her writing extraordinary.
Yes. That's what I meant, that there's just so many that we can get into a conversation about. There are a lot of different people that I've drawn influences from. And that's why I think you have to read a lot. And there again, just read, and not just the same genre. Don't just read the rom-com or don't just read the mystery book. Read them all. Read poetry, read plays, scripts. And the more you learn about dialogue, it just becomes internalized. So I think widely reading is really important.
Speaking of dialogue, okay, what are we going to do with you? This book is so crazy. Okay, I thought you'd like that.
I did. I did. I got a big kick out of it.
Tell us where you got the idea for this story, and then we'll talk about the different chapters because it is really quite funny.
I got the idea for it. I'd say going back, I was at the gym. It was about 20 years ago, and I was under a lot of stress. I had some issues that I was going through. It's a bit of a low point, and so I started working on a regular basis, and I was feeling better. And then I got to know people, and one of the trainers at the gym one day gave me this pile of papers, and it was like this training regimen. He thought I'd find it helpful because he saw me in a lot. And I took it home, and he was like, "Oh, don't pass it around. Don't tell anybody I gave this to you." It's okay. And it's this based on the Bulgarian training methods, because as you said in the beginning, they're well known for powerlifters, gymnasts, all sorts of sports, especially back in the days of when they were under Soviet rule and there were state sports federations. And there's a very famous coach for the powerlifting team who eventually emigrated to the US. And so people were trying to figure out what's the secret of this Bulgarian coach? What's his secret sauce? How come his athletes are winning so many gold medals? And this is like supposedly their training method. Of course, for me, it was ridiculous because you'd have to go to the gym 3 times a day and do things that I was completely incapable of doing. But I found it funny, so I never forgot that. And I thought, I got to write about this someday. It just, the whole thing seems so preposterous, this chase for the Bulgarian secrets. And anyway, so I put it years later when I started writing this novel, which was quite different. I was in my Master's of Fine Arts program. And long story short, I did a short story based on the manual. And afterward, people said to me, "Oh, is this part of a book? Is this what comes next? What happens with the manual?" And I'm thinking, I have no idea. This is all I've written, 8 pages. And then it got me thinking that maybe there is something here. So I molded over and I started writing and more. And it took years of stopping and starting and revising.
It's fascinating. It's really fascinating. First, I never read about a book before I get it. I don't look at the back cover. I look at the front cover, but I don't look at the back cover. I don't read anything. I love the reveal. And of course, at the beginning, I get to read the index. And I love all of your wonderful titles, chapter titles. And so you have to explain them. And we have one set of chapter titles that repeats itself many times, and that's the three Lombardis. So why don't we start there and tell us about the three Lombardis? Then we'll go from there.
Okay, for the three Lombardis, I was looking to put little bits of academic material. And as I said, a lot of this book was written during my time with my master's programs. And one of the faculty members thought maybe I should do something like that. I said, but it would destroy the tone. This is a comic novel. How are we going to just pop a serious quote into the beginning of a chapter? But I did think about it, and I said, and then I came up with an idea and the whole book is a parody. So this would be along the same lines. On TV, radio, there's always panels of experts. And CNN, wherever, they got 3 people and they're weighing in on a topic, and the Greek chorus idea. So I decided, why not have a panel of experts selecting the archival and academic material? And who to do that but some Jersey City contractors, physical contractors. And actually, most of the names, or all of the names really, are made up in the book, except Pete Lombardi. He is a real person. And how I ended up choosing him and just going with it, because he's such a character. He did an extension on my house like 10 years ago. And when he did it, and he's just like I described him. He's this guy and he works out in the gym, and then he's doing the work. Then I needed to have a retaining wall with this construction. And he goes, "Oh, that's my brother Frankie." I said, "Your brother Frankie does retaining walls?" "Yeah, and driveways and this and that." And I'm like, okay. Then finally the work is done, but the yard is a mess from the construction. And I mentioned that, "Oh, I've got to go get plants. I need a landscaper." He goes, "Oh, my cousin Luigi." I'm like, "What?" So I was like, how many Lombardis are there that do this? And I didn't know when I started out. So I always thought it was so funny. And so I thought of also like the 3 tenors. We have the 3 tenors singing, the 3 Lombardis. And so I put that aside. And as I said, everything counts. And here I'm thinking, these quotes. And I have in my mind the 3 Lombardis, which I thought was really funny out of context of anything. So I said, that's it. They're going to be my panel of experts. And then, so that I thought was a kind of a funny way of them discussing and introducing what actually is serious material. People like Neil Gaiman and Balanchine about creativity and singers, but it presents it so that's not just taking you out of the book. I didn't want to take the reader out and say, okay, here's a serious comment. Instead, I had these kind of funny characters introducing it.
Tell us about your main character and how it all starts.
All right, there's Tina's the main character. It's a first person narrator. And I wanted a tough girl, city attitude with a capital A type of narrator, very immediate. I toyed with putting in the past tense, but I decided present tense is where it should be. So you're really in her head as she's encountering things, bewildered, confused, angry, whatever's going on. You
Oh
put it
yeah,
right there. Yeah, it's very,
we get in her head, all right.
you get in her head. Yes. And so, and again, this is like some of the voices from like the laundromat and those people that would come in and I would talk to. And it also, in my own background, my father, as I said, was a knife sharpener. We lived in a very blue collar town and on Long Island in New York, which then people said they'd still do Long Island. And there was a kind of a real accent. I probably still have some of it, but it's been toned down. And of course, I speak more grammatically correct now because of my education. But this is a voice that I had heard many times growing up, and so that's what I did. So and Tina, it's almost like the Wizard of Oz, which I didn't start off that way, but I realized after I had written just about the whole thing, where Dorothy's from Kansas, but she's not happy. She's got all these grievances. She hates her teachers. Nobody pays attention to her. She's got all kinds of issues. But then she ends up in a very unlikely way, goes off on a flying house on this big adventure. And at the end of her adventure, the Glinda tells her about the ruby slippers. It's, oh, you didn't need that. You could have gone home anytime you wanted. And then the Scarecrow goes, why didn't you tell her? And she said she wouldn't have believed me. And then I thought, yeah, you know what? I subconsciously or otherwise, that's Tina, because she has this attitude and she goes off on this incredible, unlikely magical realism adventure and then learns a lot about herself. So the book, the Bulgarian Training Manual, because this is a book about a book, and Tina gets this book that she's given at the gym, just like I was given this material. But the very fact of having the book isn't what makes her have these realizations. It's really gives her the confidence and to the insight to think, I've got this. I can control my life. I can do these things. And anyway, that's what happens to Tina.
We're back to some of the chapters. I love the names of them. I always find that intriguing, how you come out with the names and then the stories in each one of them. So which ones do you want to tell about? Let's do the eye candy.
Yeah, eye candy. Sometimes the names just popped out at me. And eye candy, it's all about perception and how one perceives oneself, not just internally, but externally. It might have a good day, bad day, and all kinds of things. And one day I saw a performer, a Cher impersonator, a man dressed as Cher. And I had my baby at the time with me. It was a very unlikely place to bring a baby, but it was all glittery and everything else. And she was like less than a year old and really looking at everything. And then the Cher impersonator goes, oh, it's eye candy. No wonder she likes it. And I thought, eye candy, that's interesting. Yeah, it is. And so anyway, I just thought that was a fun little thing that I again just popped into my head. And for some of the other ones, like Moose and Squirrel, that chapter was a direct takeoff on Rocky and Bullwinkle, and Natasha and Boris and Natasha. And the idea of being interviewed, this is supposed to be like an episode of ESPN, but Bulgaria's version of ESPN. And so you have the person with the microphone and the whole entourage. But it turns out it's because it's Eastern Europe and Natasha was Russian. So I thought, why don't we just have fun with that?
Did you ever get the urge to actually take the trip to Bulgaria?
I thought of it, but it wasn't really necessary. And in some ways, I'd like to, if I went there, it would be great. But I didn't want to get too much into the realism part. I wanted to resist the
Yeah.
idea of to include places and people. Instead, I set it like in the middle of the forest somewhere. It's like a magical forest. And because I didn't want to be walking around the streets of Sofia, I did do research. I read a lot of websites and travel guides and everything for Bulgaria. So I knew the names of the towns. I had a general feel. I knew the mountains and what the geography was like. But I just then used that as a backdrop to set the characters. Because one of the things I learned in reading about Bulgaria as I went along was that they have a very big industry of people like being outsourced. They work for American companies, like for customer service and insurance companies and what have you. So I decided who better than to be transformed by this gym would be a bunch of dweebs, basically, is what I call them, sitting before computer screens, like answering the telephone. And I decided to have fun with that too, like adopting American accents and having names like, oh, this is like Jenny, and how can I help you? And really, person in the middle of nowhere in Bulgaria. And then also there's a lot of corruption and organized crime from what I've read in Bulgaria. So then I have, okay, here's the bad gym people, the good gym people, and they have this good versus evil quest contest. And so it helped spark my imagination the more I read about it.
This is your first published book, right?
Definitely. Yes, it is. It's my first book that I've had published. I wrote a book before this book that wasn't any good. It was just like my first attempt at writing a novel. But after I had it finished, after 200 something pages, I was like, this is not hanging together correctly. It's not ready. So then I put it aside. And then a couple of years later, I tried again and I wrote this. And I think it takes a lot of practice. I've been a journalist, and so I've written hundreds of newspaper articles, magazine pieces, essays, but writing 10, 15 pages, 2 pages, very different from writing 300 pages. And when I started it, that's why I started with this kind of bad first novel that then got thrown away, because it was just the idea, like, how do I get from page 1 to 250 or 300? And then I figured that out, and I got into my MFA program, and I started really learning from some of the experts too and getting good feedback. And now this is what I have. But yeah, it took a long time to have the courage really to write a novel.
So, how did you get published?
Uh, I had started sending my manuscript out to agents, which is the usual route. And I wasn't too far along that journey when Kaylee Jones, who's a writer and also she has a publishing imprint, but different kinds of books than mine, she knew these people at a small press, and she said they just got distribution, which is really important, so it can be covered, it'll be in bookstores. But she really liked them and liked the books that they were publishing, and she gave me their contact information. And so I contacted them, and she contacted them, and I sent it off to them, and they read it. And about a month later, it was like a dream. It was like they called and they were so enthusiastic and they wanted to publish it. But meanwhile, I was hesitant too. I had to make sure that this is the right fit for me, not just that, oh, good, someone will publish it and just go. But I talked to them. I looked at their list, the other books they were publishing had great covers. I did not expect such an amazing cover, but I figured it would be good because they had a lot of interesting covers. And also, I took Kaylee's word for it too, because she wouldn't steer me wrong. And her father wrote From Here to Eternity. Her father was James Jones, and she's a very good writer in her own right and knows a lot of people. And if she thought this is the right fit, and it was, it turned out that that kind of camaraderie and enthusiasm they had for it has worked out very well.
I can see that. And as I said, both the production value of the book is great, and also they got some great reviews for you and blurbs, and which is very important.
Yeah, it's Clash Books in upstate New York, and they were very good. And I'd recommend to any writer, anybody out there thinking of writing, just talk to everyone. Just don't look at a list and send out your queries. You can do that, absolutely, but also speak to everyone. And who's someone else's agent, who's someone else's publisher, how did they get there? And so the more writers and editors that you know that you talk to, the more doors it opens up.
It's not easy to get a book published. One of the people I interviewed when I just started Joy on Paper Live was Steve Barry. He was rejected 86 times.
Wow.
And now I think he's just hitting 30 million books. It was good that he stuck with it.
You have to have that intestinal fortitude too. Don't take it personally. And it's easy to say, but harder to do. I was rejected a bunch of times. I just happened to luck out in a way that because of how I said it happened. But if that hadn't happened, it might have been like 40 rejections until I found something, 50, 100. It's, you just got to keep going because it's not, many times it's the gatekeeper. I know this now and I didn't know before. You might have an intern who's, it's their job to weed through the thousands of submissions. And if for some reason it's not their cup of tea, they'll pass. But maybe if you just happen to get the intern sitting in the next desk, they would have taken it. In fact, I know I was talking to Rick Moody, who wrote The Ice Storm, and he's a really well known writer. But before he was a writer, he was working at a publishing house. I think it was Little Brown or one of those places. And I was talking about Mark Lehner before. He told me that he passed, oh, he wanted to them to publish Mark's first book, and the publishing house didn't want to do that. It wasn't Little Brown, I forget what it was. But anyway, they said no. And then somebody else picked it up and it ended up on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. And he was like, see, I told you should have published it, but they were just, nah, this is too crazy. They didn't want to do it. So, you never know. You got to keep going and keep going.
Yeah, definitely. And your book, it is so different from everything else. It is. It's a rarity. And I can see that many people, and particularly, and as you say, the gatekeepers sometimes, and this happened always in Hollywood. I had 3 of my scripts optioned in Hollywood, but I learned the process there of what happens and of how the gatekeepers, and many times it was just students from UCLA who were, they themselves were writing scripts. So you were really facing a hard thing if you could get through. You have to be persistent, and authors have so many things to do. It's, people don't understand the difficulty really of getting a book published, not just finding an agent, finding a publisher, coming out with everything that you need around it, and then having to deal with editors, with everything else that happens, which of course, now being a journalist, your work probably went in pretty clean, grammatically speaking and style wise. But still, did you have comments from your editor that we cannot use this language or something like that? Because it's a little risque sometimes.
Yeah, there's a lot of 4-letter words, but that's part of my way my narrator talks. But there are a few places where there were a few things that she says that are grammatically incorrect, but intentionally. It's not because I made a mistake. So they would just ask. They were really good to work with because the editor would go, did you mean to say this or this? And I'm like, nope, I meant to say that, because that's in her voice. If I suddenly made her sound like she had a PhD in literature, it wouldn't be that voice anymore. So yeah, but everything is new. Like when you get to that point, you think I'm done. No, you're not done, because they want the acknowledgments and this and that and you got to, I don't know, read it. I got tired of reading my own book after a while, because every time they did a few corrections, they want you to read it again. And that took a while. And then when it comes out, I don't know anything about promoting a book. Everything. Like last night, I did a reading at a bookstore. That was the first one I did for my book, because technically June 4th is the publication date, the official date that bookstores are supposed to bring it out. People had pre-ordered, but that was the date. When I was a wreck, I'm thinking, what if nobody shows up? And it turns out it was a packed house at the bookstore. But until I saw people standing and all the chairs taken, I was sure that this was going to be the disaster of my life. It's like everything is new as you go along.
And of course, they all want you to build a platform and have social media. And have you found that a daunting process too?
Oh my gosh. Like a year ago, I would not have been able to put up anything on Instagram other than a picture with a caption. And my daughter, meanwhile, is posting things with little like sparkly stuff and people dancing on the edges and music. And I'm like, how do you do that? And they're trying to explain. So I just had to go to it. I just sat down at night and I just said, okay, this is an arts and crafts project. I am going to see what I can do. And some of them the first ones were terrible. I'd have some with no sound and my mouth is moving. I'm like, oh, this is so embarrassing. And now I think it's fun. I can do this, more or less.
More or less. I know the feeling. It is complicated. And for authors, there are so many things that they need. But one of the things, of course, they need to get reviews. And so I hope that a lot of people will get your book and put reviews up on Amazon and the other areas where they put reviews, because it really helps.
Yeah, it's really important. It's like that old saying about it was that if a tree falls in the woods, and does anybody hear it? Does it make a sound? It's if 100 people read the book and they absolutely love it, but nobody knows that they love it. And but if there's those Amazon reviews on there, it's really helpful for someone else considering it.
I want to thank you really so much for joining me today. It's been wonderful to talk to you. I think the book is very clever. Very, it just, I needed this book. And I think you've created a wonderful book. I named this program Joy on Papers. Once have, you've got this joy, you've had joy before, but when you have the full time book joy, seeing your book on the shelves, I'm sure you're writing another book, right?
Yes, yeah. But I'm
Yes.
at really early stages, and there's two things I'm thinking about that I'm writing simultaneously. So I don't have a title, I don't even have a plot. But I'm thinking of, yeah, it's based on some of the characters that are minor characters here, and also characters that I left out because I realized that when I was writing the book, a really important part is editing. Don't hold on to your words like they're so sacred if they don't fit. And I had too many characters at one point. So I said, nope, some of these people have to go. And I trimmed them out, and but I saved them. They'll come
Yeah,
back.
they're there. They're there. And how about your family? Are any of the characters your family, and do they recognize themselves as characters in your book?
It's interesting. Not really, not the characters in the book, certainly not my kids, but the grandmother in the book actually is based on my own grandmother who had a hard life, and she lived in the city. And when there's a grandmother who likes to watch professional wrestling on TV, and that was my grandmother. She would drink beer. In her case, it was Wrangel beer because it was years ago, but now I changed that to Bud, and I changed her character somewhat. But this image of my grandmother sitting there like watching boxing and wrestling, it was like so weird. Nobody's grandmother did that. It was just funny. And again, everything from your life, somehow you create them into a character.
Thank you, Ruth. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. And let's just tell people you have a website just with your name,
Yes.
and
Yes.
people can go there and find out more about you. And I'm sure they can follow you on social media. And you'll be back when you finish the book, that one of the books that you're working on.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I love your graphics. They're so cute and clever.
Thank you very much. It's been a joy to talk to you. Bye bye now.
Bye bye.
Bye.